Well, now everybody's really bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. So in thinking about environmental markets, water and energy often come up because they have been some of the pioneers in environmental markets. So that's where the connection is coming. It's not water interacting with energy so much in what I will be talking about today, but these two aspects of where we can think about markets and how markets might help us achieve some of our improved environmental outcomes. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the false start, we all come to Banff and enjoy the beautiful scenery and realize the value in this pristine ecosystem that we have here. And we are, as Canadian citizens, most of us here, are willing to continue the support of the national park system and make sure that that remains a public resource available for the enjoyment of our tourists and for ourselves. And we, even though sometimes reluctantly, are willing to pay park pass fees in order to be able to come here, and we're willing to pay the cost of our time and transportation in order to also come here and enjoy the scenery, the wildlife, and other things that we enjoy here in Banff. So we have fresh water, clean air, and other environmental benefits coming from a place like this. As Dr. Bill Schodek said this morning, though, sometimes when we don't have these resources, when we have little water or poor air quality, we may realize how much we are willing to pay to actually achieve such a benefit. So we have ecosystems. I'll start with the definition for an ecosystem being the complex interaction of animals, plants, and the non-living environment, and the ecosystem services are benefits that humans receive from well-functioning ecosystems. And so these can be services, can be ones that we actually pay for, where we have food and fiber that we pay for within our markets, in our commodity markets, and those are things that our well-functioning ecosystems provide for us. And we know that when we have a healthy ecosystem, our farms do well, and we also have ecosystem services such as regulating climate, regulating floods, disease, and waste. Some of those services we don't really pay for so much unless we're having to clean up things. Some of the other ecosystem services, supporting services, and cultural services, again, those are ones that are not often seen within the market. We also know, though, that changes in ecosystems and in ecosystem services affect our well-being, and that was also evident in Dr. Schodek's talk today as he talked about mental health and the impact of going for a walk in the woods on our mental health. So the problem with a lot of these ecosystem services, the ones that are not seen within our markets, is that they are public goods, and anyone can enjoy them without having to pay for them. So they're valued by society, but we have some issues with actually being able to have the full quantity of public goods that we would all want to obtain. So they can be obtained without any payment, but there's also no financial reward for providing these public goods, and so they tend to be underprovided. And there's often a cost for providing them, where if you want to provide good air quality, for example, if each of us were to be involved in the provision of good air quality, we may not be driving our cars as much, but that's a cost, right? We still want to drive our cars because we have to get somewhere. So, so the same sort of thing for someone else who's providing a public good. So as I said before, we can call, these are ecosystem services that are public goods. We have clean air and clean water, wildlife habitat, soil conservation, and the enjoyable views that I mentioned before. So what are some of the ways that we could achieve better environmental outcomes? Well, some of the things that we've done in the past include regulations and standards where the government is the main player and puts restrictions on emissions or make sure we maintain certain water quality standards. But for having effective regulation and standards, we really need to have the financial support or the government oversight in order to have sufficient monitoring and enforcement. So you can have a law or a standard, but without actual enforcement, it really isn't worth anything. And especially regulations and standards can be useful when you can work well when you have point source pollution, when you have a power plant or something that's affecting water quality and you can control it at that source. But these are especially difficult to implement when you have non-point source solutions, when you have diverse pollution sources. And there are also some significant issues of scale. The other thing we can do is appeal to stewardship motives, and that's something that anybody who's been involved in any kind of extension with farmers or other environmental quality aspects can say they have experience in, where we say, well, we should all be willing to do something in order to be better stewards of the land that we're owning or whatever. So we have extension, we have education, we encourage people to do something that will provide better environmental production, better environmental services. And in some cases, it works really well when there's this threat of regulation. So for example, when you're working with dairy farmers, when I was working with dairy farmers in California and the water quality was significantly impacted by these 3,000 cow dairies and their lack or less than positive way of dealing with manure. Then when the water quality people started coming at them and saying, we're going to regulate you, then they started being pretty happy to see the extension people come along and say, let's figure out how we can manage the manure nutrients better. So, but the problem with this, with trying to appeal to stewardship motives, is that landowners and operations are quite heterogeneous, and so there's not one solution fits all opportunity, and it also ignores the cost of the change. So if it's quite costly for someone to make a change, they have pretty low priority of making that happen. And then the other issue with both of these is, what should we actually be targeting? And should we be targeting an activity, or do you actually target a measurable environmental outcome? And that's something that we need to consider throughout any of the ecosystem services markets. Is, do you want to reward someone for doing something, or do you want to reward someone for the actual benefit that you've achieved? Because that can be very heterogeneous from one location to another as well. So when we start talking about markets, when I start talking to some of my friends who are more on the environmental, more liberal sort of side of things, then we have some comments such as, well, firms, they just pollute because they're malevolent, right? But pollution is really, if we think about it as a society, is a consequence of these firms producing something that we're asking for, that we're demanding. Another thing is that one of my friends said to me, well, why are you working with encouraging farmers to clean up the environment when they should be doing that anyway? We shouldn't need to pay them to improve environmental stewardship. But unfortunately, such altruism doesn't feed the family, doesn't keep your farm in business, and that kind of thing. So we have problems there too. The other issue that people will bring up is that, well, then we're going to have just unfettered competition between private firms, and we're going to sell the water. So we have the issue that Dr. Percy brought up again too, the problems that people have with when you say, well, you can't make it a commodity, you can't make biodiversity a commodity, you can't make carbon a commodity, water quality, air quality. If we commodify it, then it becomes less valuable, and it's not equitable for all of society. But however, if markets are properly managed, most outcomes are publicly determined because there is some significant public oversight, government oversight, but the way of doing it is determined by the market, so that we have the most efficient outcome possible. So that we, for example, if a big emitter of carbon dioxide, if it's very expensive for them to reduce their emissions, but it costs less for someone to sequester carbon or someone else to reduce their emissions, then by doing that you have the same impact on the atmosphere itself, but for less cost. On the other side, though, when you have someone from the more conservative side of things talking about the market, well, then you say, well, if we start doing environmental markets, there's going to be too much government involvement, and we have things like the farmers in the United States that were very upset about cap and trade proposals from the greenhouse gas perspective. saying don't cap our future because then we don't want government to be involved, we don't want government on my land. But if we're going to achieve an environmental outcome, a beneficial environmental outcome, using a market does tend to be less government involvement than a command control regulatory sort of method. The other thing that the more conservative side of people would maybe have issue with a market is that sometimes these markets might give environmental groups too much control because they have often they're often a player and a person gathered at the table when you're making negotiations. However, with these markets, the person who's providing the environmental service doesn't have to participate unless they want to. So generally, it's a voluntary participation. So the advantage of having complaints from both sides of the spectrum is that I sort of think that we're working in a good place, because if you have people complaining from both the more liberal sort of end and the more conservative sort of end, well, maybe we're actually somewhere in the middle and we might be achieving something that eventually everyone can live with. So I just wanted to now use the rest of my time here to give you some examples of and some case studies of some environmental markets that have actually been successful, and situations where landowners generally, in most of these situations it's been landowners have been paid to change practices and improve environmental outcomes and provide a service that's been of value to someone else who's been willing to pay for it. So the first example that often comes up is the example of the city of Munich in Germany, where in the late 1980s they were starting to notice changes in the water quality and seeing some agricultural pollutants, not at really significantly high levels, but seeing some of the pollutants come within their water system. And the water source for this city of 1.3 million people is actually, there's one valley, one watershed, that's the main water source, and the soil is acting as a significant filter and significant cleaner in a way for the water. And so what they started talking about was how are we going to improve the water quality so that we don't have to do any kind of other treatment before we can make this water drinkable and potable for our citizens. And so in 1991, the city of Munich started paying farmers in this watershed to convert to organic farming and reduce the use of chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides. So they started out with just a few people participating, and then because they were giving payments of 281 euros per hectare for the first 5 years, for converting to organic, the farmers started becoming quite interested. They still qualified for the other government payments for agriculture. And then, so for the first 5 years, they got 281, and then the next 12 years, they got 230 euros per hectare for maintaining these practices, and they had to go through some kind of verification process. But the city also really worked on marketing and doing things right from the production to the marketing end of things, so that the producers were guaranteed a market and that kind of thing. And they saved a significant amount of money on what they would have otherwise been paying for water filtration and water treatment for the drinking water. The cost to the city was 1 euro cent per cubic meter of water, whereas in other comparable regions, they're paying water treatment costs of 30 euro cents per cubic meter of water when they haven't done similar kind of activities. So there was a big scale one, 1.3 million people for drinking water. A very small scale local example from Honduras is in a little community called Jesus de Otero, where there were some water quality concerns dealing with the upstream land management. And this was primarily a coffee farming area, and the burning of the land, burning before and after planting was a pretty typical practice for these coffee farmers. And there became some pretty significant conflicts within the community, saying that these farmers that were upstream were really damaging the water quality for the people, and only 5,000 people in the community downstream that was drawing this water. And so there had been a publicly managed water supply, but because of all the conflicts that were going on, Catholic Relief Services came in, helped form a nonprofit, a non-government organization there that took over the management of this water supply and started encouraging farmers to change their practices and to do some more sustainable, environmentally sustainable coffee farming. And the water quality improved significantly. So in 2002, they began to pay the farmers for adopting environmentally friendly farming practices, and this whole region has really significantly changed in the way that they're farming. So there's now no longer any burning in the coffee farms, and they're using a lot of other buffer strips and things like that to prevent sediment flowing into the water. So those two examples are the water examples of environmental markets, and I wanted to move a little bit into the energy, how energy has been a significant player in environmental markets as well. And we have this significant example that's one of the biggest examples of a market in North America in the early 1990s, when acid rain was becoming a really big problem in the eastern U.S. and in eastern Canada as well. And the EPA's, the Environmental Protection Agency in the U.S., put some significant restrictions on the amount of sulfur dioxide that was allowed to be emitted from power plants. So there were about 100 coal-fired power plants in the eastern U.S. seaboard that were included in this regulation, and there was a cap put on the amount of emissions that they were allowed to do, and this cap was ratcheted down over time. So each plant had the requirement to reduce their emissions. However, what they did was they said, well, if you can't reduce your own emissions, but your neighbor or some other power plant within this whole region has been able to implement some kind of technological advance that has reduced their emissions, you can buy credits from this other power plant. And so it established a market. And the permits traded between these emitters, between these 100 power plants, and the cost at the time when this market was fully functioning was about $1,600 per ton of sulfur dioxide. And the emissions were reduced by 1/2 as a result of these things, and at a much more efficient, less costly method than would have been if it was just a command and control regulatory sort of system. So this was the first large-scale cap and trade program in the U.S. In 2005, the market really, for this, there were some significant changes in the regulation, and things started going downhill, and so it's no longer active, but it was used as this example of what we could do and something that can be successful as long as we have sufficient political policy oversight, which when that ceases to occur, we have some problems that come up. So other carbon markets have been largely driven by energy companies as well, in expectation of similar caps or other kind of regulations that would limit the carbon dioxide emissions from energy companies. And if you look at, in Western Canada, if we look at the carbon dioxide emissions by the largest emitters in Western Canada, we have coal-fired power, gas-fired power, and oil sands. This is all energy. These big emitters in Western Canada are largely energy. So those are the emitters that are covered under the Alberta cap for greenhouse gas emissions, and they're really largely coal-fired power plants and oil sands, and some of the gas-fired power as well, and petrochemical. So it's all energy related. And so in Alberta, in 2007, the cap on greenhouse gas emissions was put on all of these power plants. Any emitter that emitted more than 100 kilotons per year of carbon dioxide equivalents, and each of those units was required to reduce their annual emissions by, on an intensity basis, by 12% every year. So intensity basis means they didn't have to reduce their net emissions, but it could be adjusted somewhat depending on what they were producing. So if they increased their total production, then their total CO2 could be adjusted based on total production of power or whatever they were producing. So as a result, we've had 5.1 megatons of carbon dioxide reductions in Alberta since 2007, and a significant amount of, and a significant component of that has been offsets that have been permitted within agriculture. So we've had $61 million of revenue coming to agriculture, mostly within the tillage protocol that was implemented through Climate Change Central. Interestingly, in California, AB 32 is a bill that was put in place a few years ago and is still in its implementation stage. In 2012 this year is the first year of it actually being law, but next year will be the first year that the regulated agencies will be required to either reduce their own emissions or purchase offsets from someone else who would be having the same impact on the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. And then there are others that are functioning within the world as well, and we have a significant carbon market, excuse me, a significant carbon market in Europe, and some of that involves purchasing offsets even through the CDM program that does various projects within the developing world. And we have some voluntary markets that are active, and some of the voluntary markets are in expectation of there being a regulatory market as well. So that's where some of that is coming from, but we also have some significant action in the corporate world in just trying to achieve better sustainability, and some of that has been on the greenhouse gas end. So then the last thing I wanted to do is give you a few more examples of some farms. The USDA and Environmental Futures group, they worked together to put together a very interesting report that came out in April 2011 called Farm of the Future, where they gave case studies of 5 different farms that were that had been making changes and were receiving payments for some kind of ecosystem services. So just I'm going to go through these and give some examples of these farms throughout the US that have been participating in different environmental markets, and it ranges from carbon to nutrients to wetlands. So we have, for example, Mudford Farm in Maryland, where this was a farm that was purchased by a nonprofit agency and had been poorly managed, where they did some significant restoration and buffer installation of buffer strips, and restored wetlands, and put some permanent easements on some wetland area for wetland credits. And some of the restored wetlands were participating in nutrient credits because it's in the Chesapeake Bay area where we have some significant significant water quality problems because of excess nutrients from agriculture. And they also have been able to sell some wildlife hunting leases because they've enhanced wildlife habitat. So if you look at the farm income for 2009 for this farm in Maryland, 35% of the farm income was from the nutrient credits that were being sold to the state because they were very interested in trying to clean up the Chesapeake Bay. 20% of the income was from hunting leases, and the remainder was from the sales of the agricultural product. So this is a significant amount of money going to revenue coming from these environmental markets. And then there's another one that's a forested area of a pretty large area that was also that's also managed by a nonprofit organization, where they established a sustainable harvesting plan so that they could achieve carbon credits through the Climate Action Reserve in California. And they sold 1.1, well, the plan is, at least, they've sold some, but the plan is over the 10-year period starting in 2007 to sell 1.1 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents through the Climate Action Reserve. And they're also providing some protection for endangered species. Now, there's no payment for that at this point, but that's something that they're pursuing. So as you can see, the farm revenue, or the forested area revenue, the land revenue for 2007 to 2010, 36% of that came from the carbon credits, the sale of the carbon offsets, 53% from logging, and they gained some revenue from charity and grants because it was a pilot project, and so they were able to obtain some of their support from those resources. And in Florida, there are again some significant water quality problems for nutrients, and Buck Island Ranch in Florida is a cow-calf operation. The ranch was paid to modify water management and reduce the phosphorus loads, and so they worked on restoring wetlands and maintaining higher water levels during floods than what the farm normally had done. And so their revenue in 2007-2009, 5% of it was from the nutrient management, 3% from hunting and tourism because of enhanced habitat, 89% from cattle sales, and 3% from other agricultural sales. Then we have the Sacramento River Ranch, which had pretty poor riparian area management at the time that it was taken over by the organization that decided to try to improve this almost 4,000 acres of land along the Sacramento River. And they converted the marginal farmland in the riparian area to restored riparian habitat, where some of it became floodplain that was helpful for salmonid species, and some of it they established a species bank for a threatened beetle that the developers in the Sacramento area were having to pay because they were destroying habitat for this beetle. And they also reclaimed some irrigation drainage area for wetland habitat. So their revenue, over 50% of it, was for credit for habitat for these three different species, and 30% of the revenue came from crops and nuts, and some of it from surface water rights, and then renting some of the land to other farmers. All of those four were managed at this point because they're pilot projects trying to figure out how these environmental markets might work on a real farm basis. They're all managed at this point by nonprofit organizations. This example is actually real farm managed by this family that's been managing this farm for a long time. You'll see some difference in the total amount of money that they obtained from the environmental market. But there was a beet sugar cooperative in the 1990s that wanted to expand in this area in Minnesota, but because of water quality regulations, the Clean Water Act, they had to do something about the phosphorus that they were going to be putting into the water. And so one thing that was available to them was that they could purchase phosphorus reduction credits. And so this farm has implemented on their over 2,000 acres cover crops where they're growing sugar beets. They now grow an oat cover crop and significantly reduce the phosphorus loading to the surface water in the region. They're paid $4 an acre by the sugar beet cooperative, which is pretty small compared to that. As a result of implementing cover crops, their production of sugar beets increased by a value of $55 an acre. So their revenue in 2009 was very little of their revenue came from the environmental market, but it stimulated something else in farm improvement. And 41% of the revenue from sugar beets and the rest from corn and soybeans. So just a few issues with environmental markets. In the future, some of the things we need to consider is who will do the connection between those who value the ecosystem services and who is able to provide these services. So we have water treatment possibilities, we have capped emissions, so we have regulatory sort of things, we have corporate demand, and maybe other people who might be able to provide that brokering. And then the other question would be, who's going to ensure that the systems are fair, and who will ensure that the environmental benefits are real? And I think that's where a lot of in the field agrologists come in ensuring that we actually are realizing real environmental benefits. So, any questions? We have time for maybe one question or two.
Any questions for Alison?
Yes.
I'm wondering how you would place things like the Conservation Reserve Program in the U.S. and also the production of ethanol fuel and its impact on the landscape within this whole panorama of PGS.
The Conservation Reserve Program in the U.S. is generally paying for soil conservation. At least that's what they say is what they're paying for. And there are people who might say that by setting aside farmland, we're also doing something nice for the commodity market. But definitely the Conservation Reserve Program is an example of the public paying farmers for setting aside sensitive, generally marginal farmland for habitat provision, for soil conservation, and other environmental benefits. So it's not a functioning market, so to speak, because they have a certain amount of allowance that they can bring in licenses, and then people can renew them and that sort of thing. So it's not exactly the way that some of these environmental markets would be, because they have only certain farms will actually qualify and that sort of thing. But it could be put in that picture. Ethanol, that's I don't think that's fitting within the environmental market so much, because well, it just depends on what the true environmental benefits are, and there are some questions.
One more question I think we have time for, and that happens up first, I think. Sir.
It's a foundational question regarding ethics and philosophy. And this is about the United Nations having gone ahead and said that drinking water is a fundamental right for human beings and planet. So where are we, and can you elaborate a little bit more on some of the discussion on talking about commodification and putting water into markets when you have this fundamental question of an ethical right to water without it having to be commodified? Where are we at in Alberta?
Can you repeat the question so we can hear it?
Yeah, the question is, where are we in Alberta with regard to water being a fundamental right as defined by the United Nations, and something that every human being should have access to? Where are we going with the commodification of it? So I think I might want to speak a little bit broader than just Alberta. There are costs associated with providing water to people, but and having a market system in place that we have to pay for the purification of our water somehow. Maybe we're not paying for the water, maybe we should be paying for the purification of it. I mean, some of it is semantics and how you would talk about it as well when it comes to water quality. But there's also a significant room for public oversight in these things to make sure that we have equitable access for people, no matter what their means are, and David has something to say.
Professor Percy, you have to go ahead.
Well, how does the right to water coincide with water markets? Well, Alberta has a very simple system. We have every riparian owner, or every person who lives above groundwater, has the right to use 1 acre-foot per year of water, period. Cannot be traded, cannot be charged for, it's free. Everything else can be traded. Most people looking at implementing the right to water in African countries would say, if you're dealing with a large city, there'd be a very small allowance to everyone of water without charge, and water beyond that allowance would be less than 1 acre-foot per year, which is pretty generous in the Alberta system, could be charged for or traded. So I think it works really well with the market system. You just say there's a portion of the commodity cannot be commodified. The rest can.
Thanks so much. I think we slightly exceeded our time, and I don't want to get my arm slapped again here, so I'm going to say, please let's thank so much to